Chapter 11 of Mr. Standfast by John Buchan. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 11. The Valley of Humiliation. I collected some baggage and a pile of newly arrived letters from my rooms in Westminster, and took a taxi to my Park Lane flat. Usually I had gone back to that old place with a great feeling of comfort, like a boy from school who ranges about his room at home and examines his treasures. I used to like to see my hunting trophies on the wall, and to sink into my own armchairs. But now I had no pleasure in the thing. I had a bath and changed into uniform, and that made me feel in better fighting trim. But I suffered from a heavy conviction of abject failure, and had no share in Macgillivray's optimism. The awe with which the Black Stone gang had filled me 3 years before had revived 1,000-fold. Personal humiliation was the least part of my trouble. What worried me was the sense of being up against something inhumanly formidable and wise and strong. I believe I was willing to own defeat and chuck up the game. Among the unopened letters was one from Peter, a very bulky one which I sat down to read at leisure. It was a curious epistle, far the longest he had ever written me, and its size made me understand his loneliness. He was still at his German prison camp, but expecting every day to go to Switzerland. He said he could get back to England or South Africa if he wanted, for they were clear that he could never be a combatant again. But he thought he had better stay in Switzerland, for he would be unhappy in England with all his friends fighting. As usual, he made no complaints, and seemed to be very grateful for his small mercies. There was a doctor who was kind to him, and some good fellows among the prisoners. But Peter's letter was made up chiefly of reflection. He had always been a bit of a philosopher, and now, in his isolation, he had taken to thinking hard and poured out the results to me on pages of thin paper in his clumsy handwriting. I could read between the lines that he was having a stiff fight with himself. He was trying to keep his courage going in face of the bitterest trial he could be called on to face, a crippled old age. He had always known a good deal about the Bible, and that and the Pilgrim's Progress were his chief aids in reflection. Both he took quite literally, as if they were newspaper reports of actual recent events. He mentioned that after much consideration he had reached the conclusion that the 3 greatest men he had ever heard of or met were Mr. Valiant for Truth, the Apostle Paul, and a certain Billy Strang who had been with him in Mashonaland in '92. Billy I knew all about. He had been Peter's hero and a leader till a lion got him the Blauberg. Peter preferred Valiant for Truth to Mr. Greatheart, I think, because of his superior truculence. For being very gentle himself, he loved a bold speaker. After that he dropped into a vein of self-examination. He regretted he fell far short of any of the 3. He thought that he might with luck resemble Mr. Standfast, for like him he had not much trouble in keeping wakeful, and was also as poor as a howler, and didn't care for women. He only hoped that he could imitate him in making a good end. Then followed some remarks of Peter's on courage, which came to me in that London room as if spoken by his living voice. I have never known anyone so brave by instinct, or anyone who hated so much to be told so. It was almost the only thing that could make him angry. All his life he had been facing death, and to take risks seemed to him as natural as to get up in the morning and eat his breakfast. But he had started out to consider the very thing which before he had taken for granted, and here is an extract from his conclusions. I paraphrase him, for he was not grammatical. It's easy enough to be brave if you're feeling well and have food inside you, and it's not so difficult even if you're short of a meal and seedy, for that makes you inclined to gamble. I mean by being brave, playing the game by the right rules without letting it worry you that you may very likely get knocked on the head. It's the wisest way to save your skin. It doesn't do to think about death if you're facing a charging lion or trying to bluff a lot of savages. If you think about it, you'll get it. If you don't, the odds are you won't. That kind of courage is only good nerves and experience. Most courage is experience. Most people are a little scared at new things. You want a bigger heart to face danger which you go out to look for, and which doesn't come to you in the ordinary way of business. Still, that's pretty much the same thing, good nerves and good health, and a natural liking for rows. You see, Dick, in all that game there's a lot of fun. There's excitement and the fun of using your wits and skill, and you know the bad bits can't last long. When our Col sent me to Macban's kraal, I didn't altogether fancy the job, but at the worst it was 3 parts sport, and I got so excited that I never thought of the risk till it was over. But the big courage is the cold-blooded kind, the kind that never lets go even when you're feeling empty inside, and your blood's thin, and there's no kind of fun or profit to be had, and the trouble's not over in an hour or two, but lasts for months and years. One of the men here was speaking about that kind, and he called it fortitude. I reckon fortitude's the biggest thing a man can have, just to go on enduring when there's no guts or heart left in you. Billy had it when he trekked solitary from Garangos to the Limpopo with fever and a broken arm, just to show the Portugooses that he wouldn't be down by them. But the head man at the job was the Apostle Paul. Peter was writing for his own comfort, for fortitude was all that was left to him now. But his words came pretty straight to me, and I read them again and again, for I needed the lesson. Here was I losing heart just because I had failed in the first round, and my pride had taken a knock. I felt honestly ashamed of myself, and that made me a far happier man. There could be no question of dropping the business, whatever its difficulties. I had a queer religious feeling that Ivery and I had our fortunes intertwined, and that no will of mine could keep us apart. I had faced him before the war and won. I had faced him again and lost. The 3rd time or the 20th time we would reach a final decision. The whole business had hitherto appeared to me a trifle unreal, at any rate my own connection with it. I had been docilely obeying orders, but my real self had been standing aside and watching my doings with a certain aloofness. But that hour in the tube station had brought me into the serum, and I saw the affair not as Bullivant's or even Blenkiron's, but as my own. Before, I had been itching to get back to the front. Now I wanted to get onto Ivery's trail, though it should take me through the nether pit. Peter was right. Fortitude was the thing a man must possess if he would save his soul. The hours passed, and as I expected, there came no word from Macgillivray. I had some dinner sent up to me at 7 o'clock, and about 8 I was thinking of looking up Blenkiron. Just then came a telephone call asking me to go round to Sir Walter Bullivant's house in Queen Anne's Gate. 10 minutes later I was ringing the bell, and the door was opened to me by the same impassive butler who had admitted me on that famous night 3 years before. Nothing had changed in the pleasant green-panelled hall. The alcove was the same as when I had watched from it the departure of the man who now called himself Ivery. The telephone book lay in the very place from which I had snatched it in order to ring up the First Sea Lord. And in the back room, where that night 5 anxious officials had conferred, I found Sir Walter and Blenkiron. Both looked worried, the American feverishly so. He walked up and down the hearthrug sucking an unlit black cigar. "Say, Dick," he said, "this is a bad business. It wasn't no fault of yours. You did fine. It was us, me and Sir Walter and Mr. Macgillivray, that were the quitters." "Any news?" I asked. "So far the cover's drawn blank," Sir Walter replied. "It was the devil's own work that our friend looked your way today. You're pretty certain he saw that you recognized him?" "Absolutely. As sure as that he knew I recognized him in your hall 3 years ago, when he was swaggering as Lord Alloa." "No," said Blenkiron dolefully. "That little flicker of recognition is just the one thing you can't be wrong about. Land alive, I wish Mr. Macgillivray would come." The bell rang and the door opened, but it was not Macgillivray. It was a young girl in a white ball gown, and a cluster of blue cornflowers at her breast. The sight of her fetched Sir Walter out of his chair so suddenly that he upset his coffee cup. "Mary, my dear, how did you manage it? I didn't expect you till the late train." "I was in London, you see, and they telephoned me on your telegram. I'm staying with Aunt Doria, and I cut her theatre party. She thinks I'm at the Chandwicks dance, so I needn't go home till morning. Good evening, General Hannay. You got over the hill difficulty." "The next stage is the Valley of Humiliation," I answered. "So it would appear," she said gravely, and sat very quietly on the edge of Sir Walter's chair with her small cool hand upon his. I had been picturing her in my recollection as very young and glimmering, a dancing, exquisite child. But now I revised that picture. The crystal freshness of morning was still there, but I saw how deep the waters were. It was the clean fineness and strength of her that entranced me. I didn't even think of her as pretty, any more than a man thinks of the good looks of the friend he worships. We waited, hardly speaking a word, till Macgillivray came. The first sight of his face told his story. "Gone?" asked Blenkiron sharply. The man's lethargic calm seemed to have wholly deserted him. "Gone," repeated the newcomer. "We have just tracked him down. Oh, he managed it cleverly. Never a sign of disturbance in any of his lairs. His dinner ordered at Biggleswick, and several people invited to stay with him for the weekend, one a member of the government. 2 meetings at which he was to speak arranged for next week. Early this afternoon he flew over to France as a passenger in one of the new planes. He had been mixed up with the Air Board people for months. Of course, there's another man with another face. Miss Lamington discovered that just too late. The bus went out of its course and came down in Normandy. By this time our man's in Paris or beyond it." Sir Walter took off his big tortoiseshell spectacles and laid them carefully on the table. "Roll up the map of Europe," he said. "This is our Austerlitz. Mary, my dear, I am feeling very old." Macgillivray had the sharpened face of a bitterly disappointed man. Blenkiron had got very red, and I could see that he was blaspheming violently under his breath. Mary's eyes were quiet and solemn. She kept on patting Sir Walter's hand. The sense of some great impending disaster hung heavily on me, and to break the spell I asked for details. "Tell me just the extent of the damage," I asked. "Our neat plan for deceiving the Boche has failed. That is bad. A dangerous spy has got beyond our power. That's worse. Tell me, is there still a worst? What's the limit of mischief he can do?" Sir Walter had risen and joined Blenkiron on the hearthrug. His brows were furrowed and his mouth hard, as if he was suffering pain. "There is no limit," he said. "None that I can see, except the long suffering of God. You know the man as Ivery, and you knew him as that other whom you believed to have been shot one summer morning and decently buried. You feared the second, at least if you didn't, I did, most mortally. You realized that we feared Ivery, and you knew enough about him to see his fiendish cleverness. Well, you have the 2 men combined in one man. Ivery was the best brain Macgillivray and I ever encountered, the most cunning and patient and long-sighted. Combine him with the other, the chameleon who can blend himself with his environment, and has as many personalities as there are types and traits on the earth. What kind of enemy is that to have to fight?" "I admit it's a steep proposition. But after all, how much ill can he do? There are pretty strict limits to the activity of even the cleverest spy." "I agree. But this man is not a spy who buys a few wretched subordinates and steals a dozen private letters. He's a genius who has been living as part of our English life. There's nothing he hasn't seen. He's been on terms of intimacy with all kinds of politicians. We know that. He did it as Ivery. They rather liked him, for he was clever and flattered them, and they told him things. But God knows what he saw and heard in his other personalities. For all I know, he may have breakfasted at Downing Street with letters of introduction from President Wilson, or visited the Grand Fleet as a distinguished neutral. Then think of the women, how they talk. We're the leakiest society on earth, and we safeguard ourselves by keeping dangerous people out of it. We trust to our outer barrage. But anyone who has really slipped inside has a million chances. And this, remember, is one man in 10 millions, a man whose brain never sleeps for a moment, who is quick to seize the slightest hint, who can piece a plan together out of a dozen bits of gossip. It's as if the chief of the intelligence department was suddenly to desert to the enemy. The ordinary spy knows only bits of unconnected facts. This man knows our life and our way of thinking and everything about us." "Well, but a treatise on English life in time of war won't do much good to the Boche." Sir Walter shook his head. "Don't you realize the explosive stuff that is lying about? Ivery knows enough to make the next German peace offensive really deadly. Not the blundering thing which it has been up to now, but something which gets our weak spots on the raw. He knows enough to wreck our campaign in the field. And the awful thing is that we don't know just what he knows or what he is aiming for. This war's a packet of surprises. Both sides are struggling for the margin, the little fraction of advantage, and between evenly matched enemies it's just the extra atom of foreknowledge that tells. "Then we've got to push off and get after him," I said cheerfully. "But what are you going to do?" asked Macgillivray. "If it were merely a question of destroying an organization it might be managed, for an organization presents a big front. But it's a question of destroying this one man, and his front is a razor edge. How are you going to find him? It's like looking for a needle in a haystack, and such a needle which can become a piece of straw or a tin tack when it chooses." "All the same, we've got to do it," I said, remembering old Peter's lesson on fortitude, though I can't say I was feeling very stout-hearted. Sir Walter flung himself wearily into an armchair. "I wish I could be an optimist," he said, "but it looks as if we must own defeat. I've been at this work for 20 years, and though I've been often beaten, I've always held certain cards in the game. Now I'm hanged if I have any. It looks like a knockout, Hannay. It's no good deluding ourselves. We're men enough to look facts in the face and tell ourselves the truth. I don't see any ray of light in the business. We've missed our shot by a hair's breadth, and that's the same as missing by miles." I remember he looked at Mary as if for confirmation, but she did not smile or nod. Her face was very grave, and her eyes looked steadily at him. Then they moved and met mine, and they seemed to give me my marching orders. "Sir Walter," I said, 3 years ago you and I sat in this very room. We thought we were done to the world, as we think now. We had just that one miserable little clue to hang on to, a dozen words scribbled in a notebook by a dead man. You thought I was mad when I asked for Scudder's book, but we put our backs into the job, and in 24 hours we had won out. Remember that we were fighting against time. Now we have a reasonable amount of leisure. Then we had nothing but a piece of gibberish. Now we have a great body of knowledge, for Blenkiron has been brooding over Ivory like an old hen, and he knows his ways of working and his breed of confederate. You've got something to work on now. Do you mean to tell me that when the stakes are so big you're going to chuck in your hand?" Macgillivray raised his head. "We know a good deal about Ivory, but Ivory's dead. We know nothing of the man who was so gloriously resurrected this evening in Normandy." "Oh yes, we do. There are many faces to the man, but only one mind, and you know plenty about that mind." "I wonder," said Sir Walter, "how can you know a mind which has no characteristics except that it is wholly and supremely competent? Mere mental powers won't give us a clue. We want to know the character which is behind all the personalities. Above all, we want to know its foibles. If we had only a hint of some weakness, we might make a plan." "Well, let's set down all we know," I cried, for the more I argued the keener I grew. I told them in some detail the story of the night in the Coolin, and what I had heard there. "There's the two names, Chelius and Bommaerts. The man spoke them in the same breath as Elfenbein, so they must be associated with Ivory's gang. You've got to get the whole Secret Service of the Allies busy to fit a meaning to these two words. Surely to goodness you'll find something. Remember, those names don't belong to the Ivory part, but to the big game behind all the different disguises. Then there's the talk about the wild birds and the cage birds. I haven't a guess at what it means, but it refers to some infernal gang, and among your piles of records there must be some clue. You set the intelligence of 2 hemispheres busy on the job. You've got all the machinery, and it's my experience that if even one solitary man keeps chewing on at a problem, he discovers something." My enthusiasm was beginning to strike sparks from Macgillivray. He was looking thoughtful now instead of despondent. "There might be something in that," he said, "but it's a far-out chance." "Of course it's a far-out chance, and that's all we're ever going to get from Ivory. But we've taken a bad chance before and won. Then you've all that you know about Ivory here. Go through his dossier with a small-toothed comb, and I'll bet you find something to work on. Blenkiron, you're a man with a cool head. You admit we have a sporting chance." "Sure, Dick. He's fixed things so that the lines are across the track, but we'll clear somehow. So far as John S. Blenkiron is concerned, He's got just one thing to do in this world, and that's to follow the yellow dog and have him neatly and cleanly tied up. I've got a stack of personal affronts to settle. I was easy fruit, and he hasn't been very respectful. You can count me in, Dick." "Then we're agreed," I cried. "Well, gentlemen, it's up to you to arrange the first stage. You've some pretty solid staff work to put in before you get on the trail." "And you?" Sir Walter asked. "I'm going back to my brigade. I want a rest and a change. Besides, the first stage is office work, and I'm no use for that. But I'll be waiting to be summoned, and I'll come like a shot as soon as you hoik me out. I've got a presentiment about this thing. I know there'll be a finish, and that I'll be in at it, and I think it will be a desperate, bloody business too." I found Mary's eyes fixed upon me, and in them I read the same thought. She had not spoken a word, but had sat on the edge of a chair, swinging a foot idly, one hand playing with an ivory fan. She had given me my old orders, and I looked to her for confirmation of the new. "Miss Lamington, you are the wisest of the lot of us. What do you say?" She smiled, that shy, companionable smile which I had been picturing to myself through all the wanderings of the past month. "I think you're right. We've got a long way to go yet, for the Valley of Humiliation comes only halfway in the Pilgrim's Progress. The next stage was Vanity Fair. I might be of some use there, don't you think?" I remember the way she laughed and flung back her head like a gallant boy. "The mistake we've all been making," she said, "is that our methods are too terre-à-terre. We've a poet to deal with, a great poet, and we must fling our imaginations forward to catch up with him. His strength is his unexpectedness, you know, and we won't beat him by plodding only. I believe the wildest course is the wisest, for it's the most likely to intersect his. Who's the poet among us?" "Peter," I said, "but he's pinned down with a game leg in Germany. All the same, we must rope him in." By this time we had all cheered up, for it is wonderful what a tonic there is in a prospect of action. The butler brought in tea, which it was Bullivant's habit to drink after dinner. To me it seemed fantastic to watch a slip of a girl pouring it out for two grizzled and distinguished servants of the state and one battered soldier. As decorous a family party as you would ask to see, and to reflect that all four were engaged in an enterprise where men's lives must be reckoned at less than thistledown. After that we went upstairs to a noble Georgian drawing-room, and Mary played to us. I don't care two straws for music from an instrument, unless it be the pipes or a regimental band, but I dearly love the human voice. But she would not sing, for singing to her, I fancy, was something that did not come at will, but flowed only like a bird's note when the mood favoured. I did not want it either. I was content to let Cherry Ripe be the one song linked with her in my memory. It was Macgillivray who brought us back to business. I wish to heaven there was one habit of mind we could definitely attach to him and to no one else. At this moment he had only one meaning for us. "You can't do nothing with his mind," Blenkiron drawled. "You can't loose the bands of Orion, as the Bible says, or hold Leviathan with a hook. I reckoned I could, and made a mighty close study of his devices. But the darned cuss wouldn't stay put. I thought I had him tied down to the double bluff, and he went and played the triple bluff on me. There's nothing doing that line." A memory of Peter recurred to me. "What about the blind spot?" I asked, and I told them old Peter's pet theory. Every man that God made has his weak spot somewhere, some flaw in his character which leaves a dull patch in his brain. We've got to find that out, and I think I've made a beginning. Macgillivray, in a sharp voice, asked me my meaning. "He's in a funk of something. Oh, I don't mean he's a coward. A man in his trade wants the nerve of a buffalo. He could give us all points and courage. What I mean is that he's not clean white all through. There are yellow streaks somewhere in him. I've given a good deal of thought to this courage business, for I haven't got a great deal of it myself. Not like Peter, I mean. I've got heaps of soft places in me. I'm afraid of being drowned, for one thing, or of getting my eyes shot out. Ivory's afraid of bombs. At any rate, he's afraid of bombs in a big city. I once read a book which talked about a thing called agoraphobia. Perhaps it's that. Now, if we know that weak spot, it helps us in our work. There are some places he won't go to, and there are some things he can't do. Not well, anyway. I reckon that's useful." "Yes," said Macgillivray. "Perhaps it's not what you'd call a burning and shining light." "There's another chink in his armour," I went on. "There's one person in the world he can never practise his transformations on, and that's me. I shall always know him again, though he appeared as Sir Douglas Haig. I can't explain why, but I've got a feel in my bones about it. I didn't recognise him before, for I thought he was dead, and the nerve in my brain which should have been looking for him wasn't working. But I'm on my guard now, and that nerve's functioning at full power. Whenever and wherever and howsoever we meet again on the face of the earth, it will be Dr. Livingstone, I presume, between him and me." "That is better," said Macgillivray. "If we have any luck, Hannay, it won't be long till we pull you out of His Majesty's forces." Mary got up from the piano and resumed her old perch on the arm of Sir Walter's chair. "There's another blind spot which you haven't mentioned." It was a cool evening, but I noticed that her cheeks had suddenly flushed. "Last week Mr. Ivery asked me to marry him," she said. End of chapter 11. Chapter 12 of Mr. Standfast. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 12. I become a combatant once more. I returned to France on 13 September and took over my old brigade on the 19th of the same month. We were shoved in at the Polygon Wood on the 26th, and after 4 days got so badly mauled that we were brought out to refit. On 7 October, very much to my surprise, I was given command of a division and was on the fringes of the Ypres fighting during the first days of November. From that front we were hurried down to Cambrai in support, but came in only for the last backwash of that singular battle. We held a bit of the Saint-Quentin sector till just before Christmas, when we had a spell of rest in billets, which endured, so far as I was concerned, till the beginning of January, when I was sent off on the errand which I shall presently relate. That is a brief summary of my military record in the latter part of 1917. I am not going to enlarge on the fighting. Except for the days of the Polygon Wood, it was neither very severe nor very distinguished, and you will find it in the history books. What I have to tell of here is my own personal quest, for all the time I was living with my mind turned two ways. In the morasses of the Hannay flats, in the slimy support lines at Zonnebeek, in the tortured uplands around Flequières, and in many other odd places, I kept worrying at my private conundrum. At night I would lie awake thinking of it, and many a toss I took into shell holes, and many a time I stepped off the duck boards, because my eyes were on a different landscape. Nobody ever chewed a few wretched clues into such pulp as I did during those bleak months in Flanders and Picardy. For I had an instinct that the thing was desperately grave, graver even than the battle before me. Russia had gone headlong to the devil, Italy had taken it between the eyes and was still dizzy, and our own prospects were none too bright. The Boche was getting uppish, and with some cause, and I foresaw a rocky time ahead till America could line up with us in the field. It was the chance for the wild birds, and I used to wake in a sweat to think what devilry Ivery might be engineering. I believe I did my proper job reasonably well, but I put in my most savage thinking over the other. I remember how I used to go over every hour of every day, from that June night in the Cotswolds till my last meeting with Bullivant in London, trying to find a new bearing. I should probably have got brain fever if I hadn't had to spend most of my days and nights fighting a stiffish battle with a very watchful Hun. That kept my mind balanced, and I dare say it gave an edge to it, for during those months I was lucky enough to hit on a better scent than Bullivant and Macgillivray and Blenkiron, pulling 1,000 wires in their London offices. I will set down in order of time the various incidents in this private quest of mine. The first was my meeting with Geordie Hamilton. It happened just after I rejoined the brigade, when I went down to have a look at our Scots Fusilier battalion. The old brigade had been roughly handled on the 31st July, and had had to get heavy drafts to come anywhere near strength. The Fusiliers especially were an almost new lot, formed by joining our remnants to the remnants of a battalion in another division and bringing about a dozen officers from the training unit at home. I inspected the men and my eyes caught sight of a familiar face. I asked his name and the colonel got it from the sergeant major. It was Lance Corporal George Hamilton. Now, I wanted a new batman, and I resolved then and there to have my old antagonist. That afternoon he reported to me at brigade headquarters. As I looked at that solid, bandy-legged figure, standing as stiff to attention as a tobacconist's sign, his ugly face hewn out of brown oak, his honest, sullen mouth, and his blue eyes staring into vacancy, I knew I had got the man I wanted. "Hamilton," I said, "you and I have met before." "Sir?" came the mystified answer. "Look at me, man, and tell me if you don't recognize me." He moved his eyes a fraction in a respectful glance. "Sir, I don't mind of you." "Well, I'll refresh your memory. Do you remember the hall in New Mill Street and the meeting there? You had a fight with a man outside and got knocked down." He made no answer, but his colour deepened. "And a fortnight later in a public house in Muirtown you saw the same man and gave him the chase of his life." I could see his mouth set, for visions of the penalties laid down by the King's regulations for striking an officer must have crossed his mind, but he never budged. "Look me in the face, man," I said. "Do you remember me now?" He did as he was bid. "Sir, I mind of you." "Have you nothing more to say?" He cleared his throat. "Sir, I did not ken I was hittin' an officer." "Of course you didn't. You did perfectly right, and if the war was over and we were both free men I would give you a chance of knocking me down here and now. That's got to wait. When you saw me last I was serving my country, though you didn't know it. We're serving together now, and you must get your revenge out of the Boche. I'm going to make you my servant, for you and I have a pretty close bond between us. What do you say to that?" This time he looked me full in the face. His troubled eye appraised me and was satisfied. "I'm proud to be servant to ye, sir," he said. Then out of his chest came a strangled chuckle, and he forgot his discipline. "Losh, but you're the great lad." He recovered himself promptly, saluted, and marched off. The second episode befell during our brief rest after the Polygon Wood, when I had ridden down the line one afternoon to see a friend in the heavy artillery. I was returning in the drizzle of evening, clanking along the greasy path between the sad poplars, when I struck a Labour company repairing the ravages of a Boche strafe that morning. I wasn't very certain of my road and asked one of the workers. He straightened himself and saluted, and I saw beneath a disreputable cap the features of the man who had been with me in the Coolin crevice. I spoke a word to his sergeant, who fell him out, and he walked a bit of the way with me. "Great Scott, Wake, what brought you here?" I asked. "Same thing as brought you, this rotten war." I had dismounted and was walking beside him, and I noticed that his lean face had lost its pallor, and that his eyes were less hot than they used to be. "You seem to thrive on it," I said, for I did not know what to say. A sudden shyness possessed me. Wake must have gone through some violent cyclones of feeling before it came to this. He saw what I was thinking and laughed in his sharp, ironical way. "Don't flatter yourself you've made a convert. I think as I always thought. But I came to the conclusion that since the fates had made me a government servant, I might as well do my work somewhat less cushioned than a chair in the Home Office. Oh no, it wasn't a matter of principle. One kind of work's as good as another, and I'm a better clerk than a navvy. With me it was self-indulgence. I wanted fresh air and exercise." I looked at him, mud to the waist, and his hands all blistered and cut with unaccustomed labour. I could realise what his associates must mean to him, and how he would relish the rough tonguing of non-coms. "You're a confounded humbug," I said. "Why on earth didn't you go into an OTC and come out with a commission? They're easy enough to get." "You mistake my case," he said bitterly. "I experienced no sudden conviction about the justice of the war. I stand where I always stood. I'm a non-combatant, and I wanted a change of civilian work. No, it wasn't any idiotic tribunal sent me here. I came of my own free will, and I'm really rather enjoying myself." "It's a rough job for a man like you," I said. "Not so rough as the fellows get in the trenches." I watched a battalion marching back today, and they looked like ghosts who had been years in muddy graves, white faces and dazed eyes and leaden feet. Mine's a cushy job. I like it best when the weather's foul. It cheats me into thinking I'm doing my duty." I nodded towards a recent shell hole. "Much of that sort of thing?" "Now and then. We had a good dusting this morning. I can't say I like it at the time, but I like to look back on it. A sort of moral anodyne." "I wonder what on earth the rest of your lot make of you?" "They don't make anything. I'm not remarkable for my bonhomie. They think I'm a prig, which I am. It doesn't amuse me to talk about beer and women, or listen to a gramophone, or grouse about my last meal. But I'm quite content, thank you. Sometimes I get a seat in a corner of a YMCA hut, and I've a book or two. My chief affliction is the padre. He was up at Keble in my time, and, as one of my colleagues puts it, wants to be too bloody helpful. What are you doing, Hannay? I see you're some kind of general. They're pretty thick on the ground here." "I'm a sort of general. Soldiering in the salient isn't the softest of jobs, but I don't believe it's as tough as yours is for you. Do you know, Wake, I wish I had you in my brigade. Trained or untrained, you're a dashed stout-hearted fellow." He laughed, with a trifle less acidity than usual. "Almost thou persuadest me to be combatant. No, thank you, I haven't the courage, and besides there's my jolly old principles. All the same, I'd like to be near you. You're a good chap, and I've had the honour to assist in your education. I must be getting back, or the sergeant will think I've bolted." We shook hands, and the last I saw of him was a figure saluting stiffly in the wet twilight. The third incident was trivial enough, though momentous in its results. Just before I got the division I had a bout of malaria. We were in support in the salient in very uncomfortable trenches behind Velchi, and I spent 3 days on my back in a dugout. Outside was a blizzard of rain, and the water now and then came down the stairs through the gas curtain and stood in pools at my bed foot. It wasn't the merriest place to convalesce in, but I was hard as nails at the time, and by the third day I was beginning to sit up and be bored. I read all my English papers twice, and a big stack of German ones, which I used to have sent up by a friend in the GHQ intelligence, who knew I liked to follow what the Boche was saying. As I dozed and ruminated in the way a man does after fever, I was struck by the tremendous display of one advertisement in the English press. It was a thing called Gussiter's Deep Breathing System, which, according to its promoter, was a cure for every ill, mental, moral, or physical, that man can suffer. Politicians, generals, admirals, and music-hall artists all testified to the new life it had opened up for them. I remember wondering what these sportsmen got for their testimonies, and thinking I would write a spoof letter myself to old Gussiter. Then I picked up the German papers, and suddenly my eye caught an advertisement of the same kind in the Frankfurter Zeitung. It was not Gussiter this time, but one Weissmann, and his game was identical, deep breathing. The Hun style was different from the English, all about the goddess of health, the nymphs of the mountains, and 2 quotations from Schiller, but the principle was the same. That made me ponder a little, and I went carefully through the whole batch. I found the advertisement in the Frankfurter, and in 1 or 2 rather obscure Volksstimmes und Volkszeitungs. I found it too in Der Grosse Krieg, the official German propagandist picture paper. They were the same all but one, and that one had a bold variation, for it contained 4 of the sentences used in the ordinary English advertisement. This struck me as fishy, and I started to write a letter to Macgillivray, pointing out what seemed to be a case of trading with the enemy, and advising him to get on to Mr. Gussiter's financial backing. I thought he might find a Hun syndicate behind him. And then I had another notion, which made me rewrite my letter. I went through the papers again. The English ones, which contained the advertisement, were all good, solid, bellicose organs, the kind of thing no censorship would object to leaving the country. I had before me a small sheaf of pacifist prints, and they had not the advertisement. That might be for reasons of circulation, or it might not. The German papers were either radical or socialist publications, just the opposite of the English lot, except the Grosse Krieg. Now we have a free press, and Germany has, strictly speaking, none. All her journalistic indiscretions are calculated. Therefore the Boche has no objection to his rags getting to enemy countries. He wants it. He likes to see them quoted in columns headed "Through German Glasses," and made the text of articles showing what a good Democrat he is becoming. As I puzzled over the subject, certain conclusions began to form in my mind. The 4 identical sentences seemed to hint that deep breathing had Boche affiliations. Here was a chance of communicating with the enemy which would defy the argus-eyed gentlemen who examine the mails. What was to hinder Mr. A at one end writing an advertisement with a good cipher in it, and the paper containing it getting into Germany by Holland in 3 days? Herr B at the other end replied in the Frankfurter, and a few days later shrewd editors and acute intelligence officers, and Mr. A, were reading it in London, though only Mr. A knew what it really meant. It struck me as a bright idea, the sort of simple thing that doesn't occur to clever people, and very rarely to the Boche. I wished I was not in the middle of a battle, for I would have had a try at investigating the cipher myself. I wrote a long letter to Macgillivray putting my case, and then went to sleep. When I awoke, I reflected that it was a pretty thin argument, and would have stopped the letter if it hadn't gone off early by a ration party. After that, things began very slowly to happen. The first was when Hamilton, having gone to Boulogne to fetch some mess stores, returned with the startling news that he had seen Gresson. He had not heard his name, but described him dramatically to me as the wee red-headed devil that kicked Ecky Brocky's knee yon time you was in Glasgow, sir. I recognized the description. Gresson, it appeared, was joy-riding. He was with a party of Labour delegates who had been met by 2 officers and carried off in charabancs. Hamilton reported from inquiries among his friends that this kind of visitor came weekly. I thought it a very sensible notion on the government's part, but I wondered how Gresson had been selected. I had hoped that Macgillivray had weeks ago made a long arm and quadded him. Perhaps they had too little evidence to hang him, but he was the blackest sort of suspect and should have been interned. A week later I had occasion to be at GHQ on business connected with my new division. My friends in the intelligence allowed me to use the direct line to London, and I called up Macgillivray. For 10 minutes I had an exciting talk, for I had had no news from that quarter since I left England. I heard that the Portuguese Jew had escaped, had vanished from his native heather when they went to get him. They had identified him as a German professor of Celtic languages who had held a chair in a Welsh college, a dangerous fellow, for he was an upright, high-minded, raging fanatic. Against Gresson they had no evidence at all, but he was kept under strict observation. When I asked about his crossing to France, Macgillivray replied that that was part of their scheme. I inquired if the visit had given them any clues, but I never got an answer, for the line had to be cleared at that moment for the War Office. I hunted up the man who had charge of these Labour visits, and made friends with him. Gresson, he said, had been a quiet, well-mannered, and most appreciative guest. He had wept tears on Vimy Ridge, and, strictly against orders, had made a speech to some troops he met on the Arras road about how British Labour was remembering the army in its prayers and sweating blood to make guns. On the last day he had had a misadventure, for he got very sick on the road, some kidney trouble that couldn't stand the jolting of the car, and had to be left at a village and picked up by the party on its way back. They found him better, but still shaky. I cross-examined the particular officer in charge about that halt, and learned that Gresson had been left alone in a peasant's cottage, for he said he only needed to lie down. The place was the hamlet of Eaucourt-Sainte-Anne. For several weeks that name stuck in my head. It had a pleasant, quaint sound, and I wondered how Gresson had spent his hours there. I hunted it up on the map and promised myself to have a look at it the next time we came out to rest. And then I forgot about it till I heard the name mentioned again. On 23rd October I had the bad luck, during a tour of my first-line trenches, to stop a small shell fragment with my head. It was a close, misty day, and I had taken off my tin hat to wipe my brow when the thing happened. I got a long, shallow scalp wound, which meant nothing, but bled a lot, and as we were not in for any big move, the M.O. sent me back to a clearing station to have it seen to. I was 3 days in the place, and being perfectly well, had leisure to look about me and reflect, so that I recall that time as a queer, restful interlude in the infernal racket of war. I remember yet how on my last night there a gale made the lamps swing and flicker, and turned the grey-green canvas walls into a mass of mottled shadows. The floor canvas was muddy from the tramping of many feet, bringing in the constant dribble of casualties from the line. In my tent there was no one very bad at the time, except a boy with his shoulder half blown off by a whiz-bang who lay in a drugged sleep at the far end. The majority were influenza, bronchitis, and trench fever, waiting to be moved to the base, or convalescent and about to return to their units. A small group of us dined off tinned chicken, stewed fruit, and Radon cheese around the smoky stove, where 2 screens manufactured from packing cases gave some protection against the drafts, which swept like young tornadoes down the tent. One man had been reading a book called The Ghost Stories of an Antiquary, and the talk turned on the unexplainable things that happen to everybody once or twice in a lifetime. I contributed a yarn about the men who went to look for Kruger's treasure in the Bushveld and got scared by a green wildebeest. It is a good yarn, and I'll write it down some day. A tall Highlander who kept his slippered feet on the top of the stove, and whose costume consisted of a kilt, a British warm, a grey hospital dressing-gown, and 4 pairs of socks, told the story of the Camerons at First Ypres, and of the lowland subaltern who knew no Gaelic, and suddenly found himself encouraging his men with some ancient Highland rigmarole. The poor chap had a racking bronchial cough, which suggested that his country might well use him on some warmer battleground than Flanders. He seemed a bit of a scholar, and explained the Cameron business in a lot of long words. I remember how the talk meandered on, as talk does when men are idle and thinking about the next day. I didn't pay much attention, for I was reflecting on a change I meant to make in one of my battalion commands, when a fresh voice broke in. It belonged to a Canadian captain from Winnipeg, a very silent fellow who smoked shag tobacco. "There's a lot of ghosts in this darned country," he said. Then he started to tell about what happened to him when his division was last back in rest billets. He had a staff job, and put up with the divisional command at an old French chateau. They had only a little bit of the house, the rest was shut up, but the passages were so tortuous that it was difficult to keep from wandering into the unoccupied part. One night, he said, he woke with a mighty thirst, and since he wasn't going to get cholera by drinking the local water in his bedroom, he started out for the room where they messed in to try to pick up a whiskey and soda. He couldn't find it, though he knew the road like his own name. He admitted he might have taken a wrong turning, but he didn't think so. Anyway, he landed in a passage which he had never seen before, and since he had no candle he tried to retrace his steps. Again he went wrong, and groped on till he saw a faint light, which he thought must be the room of the GSO, a good fellow and a friend of his. So he barged in and found a big dim salon with 2 figures in it and a lamp burning between them and a queer unpleasant smell about. He took a step forward, and then he saw that the figures had no faces. That fairly loosened his joints with fear, and he gave a cry. One of the 2 ran towards him, the lamp went out, and the sickly scent caught suddenly at his throat. After that he knew nothing till he awoke in his own bed the next morning with a splitting headache. He said he got the General's permission and went over all the unoccupied part of the house, but he couldn't find the room. Dust lay thick on everything, and there was no sign of recent human presence. I give the story as he told it in his drawling voice. "I reckon that was the genuine article in ghosts. You don't believe me and conclude I was drunk? I wasn't. There isn't any drink concocted yet that could lay me out like that. I just struck a crack in the old universe and pushed my head outside. It may happen to you boys any day." The Highlander began to argue with him, and I lost interest in the talk. But one phrase brought me to attention. "I'll give you the name of the darn place, and the next time you're around you can do a bit of prospecting for yourself. It's called the Chateau of Eaucourt-Sainte-Anne, about 7 kilometres from Douvecourt. If I was purchasing real estate in this country, I guess I'd give that location a miss." After that I had a grim month, what with the finish of 3rd Ypres and the hustles to Cambrai. By the middle of December we had shaken down a bit, but the line my division held was not of our choosing, and we had to keep a wary eye on the Boche doings. It was a weary job, and I had no time to think of anything but the military kind of intelligence, fixing the units against us from prisoners' stories, organising small raids, and keeping the Royal Flying Corps busy. I was keen about the last, and I made several trips myself over the lines with Archie Roylance, who had got his heart's desire and by good luck belonged to the squadron just behind me. I said as little as possible about this, for GHQ did not encourage divisional generals to practice such methods, though there was one famous army commander who made a hobby of them. It was on one of these trips that an incident occurred which brought my spell of waiting on the bigger game to an end. One dull December day, just after luncheon, Archie and I set out to reconnoitre. You know the way that fogs in Picardy seem suddenly to reek out of the ground and envelop the slopes like a shawl. That was our luck this time. We had crossed the lines, flying very high, and received the usual salute of Hun Archies. After a mile or two the ground seemed to climb up to us, though we hadn't descended, and presently we were in the heart of a cold, clinging mist. We dived for several thousand feet, but the confounded thing grew thicker and no sort of landmark could be found anywhere. I thought that if we went on at this rate we should hit a tree or a church steeple and be easy fruit for the enemy. The same thought must have been in Archie's mind, for he climbed again. We got into a mortally cold zone, but the air was no clearer. Thereupon he decided to head for home and passed me word to work out a compass course on the map. That was easier said than done, but I had a rough notion of the rate we had travelled since we had crossed the lines, and I knew our original direction, so I did the best I could. On we went for a bit, and then I began to grow doubtful. So did Archie. We dropped low down, but we could hear none of the row that's always going on for a mile on each side of the lines. The world was very eerie and deadly still, so still that Archie and I could talk through the speaking tube. "We've mislaid this bloody battle," he shouted. "I think your rotten old compass has soured on us," I replied. We decided that it wouldn't do to change direction, so we held on the same course. I was getting as nervous as a kitten, chiefly owing to the silence. It's not what you expect in the middle of a battlefield. I looked at the compass carefully and saw that it was really crocked. Archie must have damaged it on a former flight and forgotten to have it changed. He had a very scared face when I pointed this out. "Great God," he croaked, for he had a fearsome cold. "We're either about Calais or near Paris or miles the wrong side of the Boche line. What the devil are we to do?" And then, to put the lid on it, his engine went wrong. It was the same performance as on the Yorkshire moors, and seemed to be a specialty of the Shark Gladys type. But this time the end came quick. We dived steeply, and I could see by Archie's grip on the stick that he was going to have his work cut out to save our necks. Save them he did, but not by much, for we jolted down at the edge of a ploughed field with a series of bumps that shook the teeth in my head. It was the same dense, dripping fog, and we crawled out of the old bus and bolted for cover like two ferreted rabbits. Our refuge was the lee of a small copse. "It's my opinion," said Archie solemnly, "that we're somewhere about La Cateau. Tim Wilbraham got left there in the retreat, and it took him 9 months to make the Dutch frontier. It's a giddy prospect, sir." I sallied out to reconnoitre. At the other side of the wood was the highway, and the fog so blanketed sound that I could not hear a man on it till I saw his face. The first one I saw made me lie flat in the covert, for he was a German soldier, field grey, forage cap, red band and all, and he had a pick on his shoulder. A second's reflection showed me that this was not final proof. He might be one of our prisoners, but it was no place to take chances. I went back to Archie, and the pair of us crossed the ploughed field and struck the road farther on. There we saw a farmer's cart with a woman and child in it. They looked French, but melancholy, just what you would expect from the inhabitants of a countryside in German occupation. Then we came to the park wall of a great house and saw dimly the outlines of a cottage. Here, sooner or later, we would get proof of our whereabouts, so we lay and shivered among the poplars of the roadside. No one seemed abroad that afternoon. For a quarter of an hour it was as quiet as the grave. Then came a sound of whistling and muffled steps. "That's an Englishman," said Archie joyfully. "No Boche could make such a beastly noise." He was right. The form of an Army Service Corps private emerged from the midst, his cap on the back of his head, his hands in his pockets, and his walk the walk of a free man. I never saw a welcomer sight than that jam merchant. We stood up and greeted him. "What's this place?" I shouted. He raised a grubby hand to his forelock. "Ockett St. Annie, sir," he said. "Beg pardon, sir, but you ain't wurt, sir." 10 minutes later I was having tea in the mess of an MT workshop, while Archie had gone to the nearest signals to telephone for a car and give instructions about his precious bus. It was almost dark, but I gulped my tea and hastened out into the thick dusk, for I wanted to have a look at the chateau. I found a big entrance with high stone pillars, but the iron gates were locked and looked as if they had not been opened in the memory of man. Knowing the way of such places, I hunted for the side entrance and found a muddy road which led to the back of the house. The front was evidently towards a kind of park. At the back was a nest of outbuildings and a section of moat which looked very deep and black in the winter twilight. This was crossed by a stone bridge with a door at the end of it. Clearly the chateau was not being used for billets. There was no sign of the British soldier. There was no sign of anything human. I crept through the fog as noiselessly as if I trod on velvet, and I hadn't even the company of my own footsteps. I remembered the Canadian's ghost story and concluded I would be imagining the same sort of thing if I lived in such a place. The door was bolted and padlocked. I turned along the side of the moat, hoping to reach the house front, which was probably modern and boasted a civilized entrance. There must be somebody in the place, for one chimney was smoking. Presently the moat petered out and gave place to a cobbled causeway, but a wall running at right angles with the house blocked my way. I had half a mind to go back and hammer at the door, but I reflected that major generals don't pay visits to deserted chateaux at night without a reasonable errand. I should look a fool in the eyes of some old concierge. The daylight was almost gone, and I didn't wish to go groping about the house with a candle. But I wanted to see what was beyond the wall, one of those whims that beset the soberest men. I rolled a dissolute water butt to the foot of it and gingerly balanced myself on its rotten staves. This gave me a grip on the flat brick top, and I pulled myself up. I looked down on a little courtyard with another wall beyond it, which shut off any view of the park. On the right was the chateau, on the left more outbuildings. The whole place was not more than 20 yards each way. I was just about to retire by the road I had come, for in spite of my fur coat it was uncommon chilly on that perch, when I heard a key turn in the door in the chateau wall beneath me. A lantern made a blur of light in the misty darkness. I saw that the bearer was a woman, an oldish woman, round-shouldered like most French peasants. In one hand she carried a leather bag, and she moved so silently that she must have worn rubber boots. The light was held level with her head and illumined her face. It was the evilest thing I have ever beheld, for a horrible scar had puckered the skin of the forehead and drawn up the eyebrows so that it looked like some diabolical Chinese mask. Slowly she padded across the yard, carrying the bag as gingerly as if it had been an infant. She stopped at the door of one of the outhouses and set down the lantern and her burden on the ground. From her apron she drew something which looked like a gas mask and put it over her head. She also put on a pair of long gauntlets. Then she unlocked the door, picked up the lantern and went in. I heard the key turn behind her. Crouching on that wall, I felt a very ugly tremor run down my spine. I had a glimpse of what the Canadian's ghost might have been. That hag, hooded like some venomous snake, was too much for my stomach. I dropped off the wall and ran, yes, ran, till I reached the high road and saw the cheery headlights of a transport wagon and heard the honest speech of the British soldier. That restored me to my senses and made me feel every kind of a fool. As I drove back to the line with Archie, I was black ashamed of my funk. I told myself that I had seen only an old countrywoman going to feed her hens. I convinced my reason, but I did not convince the whole of me. An insensate dread of the place hung around me, and I could only retrieve my self-respect by resolving to return and explore every nook of it. End of chapter 12. Chapter 13 of Mr. Standfast by John Buchan. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 13. The Adventure of the Picardy Château. I looked up Eaucourt Sainte-Anne on the map, and the more I studied its position, the less I liked it. It was the knot from which sprang all the main routes to our Picardy front. If the Boche ever broke us, it was the place for which old Hindenburg would make. At all hours troops and transport trains were moving through that insignificant hamlet. Eminent generals and their staffs passed daily within sight of the chateau. It was a convenient halting place for battalions coming back to rest. Supposing, I argued, our enemies wanted a key spot for some assault upon the morale or the discipline or health of the British Army, they couldn't find a better than Eaucourt Sainte-Anne. It was the ideal centre of espionage. But when I guardedly sounded my friends of the intelligence, they didn't seem to be worrying about it. From them I got a chit to the local French authorities, and as soon as we came out of the line, towards the end of December, I made straight for the country town of Douvecourt. By a bit of luck our divisional quarters were almost next door. I interviewed a tremendous swell in a black uniform and black kid gloves, who received me affably and put his archives and registers at my disposal. By this time I talked French fairly well, having a natural turn for languages, but half the rapid speech of the sous-préfet was lost on me. By and by he left me with the papers and a clerk, and I proceeded to grub up the history of the chateau. It had belonged, since long before Agincourt, to the noble house of the Daucourt, now represented by an ancient marquise who dwelt at Biarritz. She had never lived in the place, which a dozen years before had been falling to ruins, when a rich American leased it and partially restored it. He had soon got sick of it. His daughter had married a blackguard French cavalry officer with whom he quarrelled, said the clerk, and since then there had been several tenants. I wondered why a house so unattractive should have let so readily, but the clerk explained that the cause was the partridge shooting. It was about the best in France, and in 1912 had shown the record bag. The list of the tenants was before me. There was a second American, an Englishman called Halford, a Paris Jew banker, and an Egyptian prince. But the space for 1913 was blank, and I asked the clerk about it. He told me that it had been taken by a woolen manufacturer from Lille, but he had never shot the partridges, though he had spent occasional nights in the house. He had a 5 years' lease and was still paying rent to the marquise. I asked the name, but the clerk had forgotten. "It will be written there," he said. "But no," I said, "somebody must have been asleep over this register. There's nothing after 1912. He examined the page and blinked his eyes. Someone indeed must have slept. No doubt it was young Louis, who is now with the guns in Champagne. But the name will be on the commissary's list. It is, as I remember, a sort of Flemish." He hobbled off and returned in 5 minutes. "Bommaerts," he said, "Jacques Bommaerts. A young man with no wife but with money. Dieu de Dieu, what oceans of it!" That clerk got 25 francs and he was cheap at the price. I went back to my division with a sense of awe on me. It was a marvellous fate that had brought me by odd routes to this out-of-the-way corner. First, the accident of Hamilton seeing Gresson, then the night in the clearing station, last the mishap of Archie's plane getting lost in the fog. I had 3 grounds of suspicion: Gresson's sudden illness, the Canadian's ghost, and that horrid old woman in the dusk. And now I had one tremendous fact. The place was leased by a man called Bommaerts, and that was one of the 2 names I had heard whispered in that far-away cleft in the Coolin by the stranger from the sea. A sensible man would have gone off to the contre-espionage people and told them his story. I couldn't do this. I felt that it was my own private find, and I was going to do the prospecting myself. Every moment of leisure I had, I was puzzling over the thing. I rode round by the chateau one frosty morning and examined all the entrances. The main one was the grand avenue with the locked gates. That led straight to the front of the house where the terrace was, or you might call it the back, for the main door was on the other side. Anyhow, the drive came up to the edge of the terrace and then split into 2, one branch going to the stables by way of the outbuildings where I had seen the old woman, the other circling round the house, skirting the moat, and joining the back road just before the bridge. If I had gone to the right instead of the left that first evening with Archie, I should have circumnavigated the place without any trouble. Seen in the fresh morning light, the house looked commonplace enough. Part of it was as old as Noah, but most was newish and jerry-built, the kind of flat-chested, thin French chateau, all front and no depth, and full of draughts and smoky chimneys. I might have gone in and ransacked the place, but I knew I should find nothing. It was borne in on me that it was only when evening fell that that house was interesting, and that I must come, like Nicodemus, by night. Besides, I had a private account to settle with my conscience. I had funked the place in the foggy twilight, and it does not do to let a matter like that slide. A man's courage is like a horse that refuses a fence. You have got to take him by the head and cram him at it again. If you don't, he will funk worse next time. I hadn't enough courage to be able to take chances with it. Though I was afraid of many things, the thing I feared most mortally was being afraid. I did not get a chance till Christmas Eve. The day before there had been a fall of snow, but the frost set in, and the afternoon ended in a green sunset with the earth crisp and crackling like a shark's skin. I dined early and took with me Geordie Hamilton, who added to his many accomplishments that of driving a car. He was the only man in the B.E.F. who guessed anything of the game I was after, and I knew that he was as discreet as a tombstone. I put on my oldest trench cap, slacks, and a pair of scaife-soled boots that I used to change into in the evening. I had a useful little electric torch which lived in my pocket, and from which a cord led to a small bulb of light that worked with a switch and could be hung on my belt. That left my arms free in case of emergencies. Likewise, I strapped on my pistol. There was little traffic in the hamlet of Eaucourt-Sainte-Anne that night. Few cars were on the road, and the M.T. detachment, judging from the din, seemed to be busy on a private spree. It was about 9 o'clock when we turned into the side road, and at the entrance to it I saw a solid figure in khaki mounting guard beside two bicycles. Something in the man's gesture, as he saluted, struck me as familiar, but I had no time to hunt for casual memories. I left the car just short of the bridge and took the road which would bring me to the terraced front of the house. Once I turned the corner of the chateau and saw the long ghostly façade white in the moonlight, I felt less confident. The eeriness of the place smote me. In that still, snowy world it loomed up immense and mysterious, with its rows of shuttered windows, each with that air which empty houses have of concealing some wild story. I longed to have old Peter with me, for he was the man for this kind of escapade. I had heard that he had been removed to Switzerland, and I pictured him now in some mountain village where the snow lay deep. I would have given anything to have had Peter with a whole leg by my side. I stepped on the terrace and listened. There was not a sound in the world, not even the distant rumble of a cart. The pile towered above me like a mausoleum, and I reflected that it must take some nerve to burgle an empty house. It would be good enough fun to break into a bustling dwelling and pinch the plate when the folk were at dinner, but to burgle emptiness and silence meant a fight with the terrors in a man's soul. It was worse in my case, for I wasn't cheered with prospects of loot. I wanted to get inside chiefly to soothe my conscience. I hadn't much doubt I would find a way, for 3 years of war and the frequent presence of untidy headquarters staffs have loosened the joints of most Picardy houses. There's generally a window that doesn't latch, or a door that doesn't bar. But I tried window after window on the terrace without result. The heavy green sun shutters were down over each, and when I broke the hinges of one there was a long bar within to hold it firm. I was beginning to think of shinning up a rainpipe and trying the second floor when a shutter I had laid hold on swung back in my hand. It had been left unfastened, and kicking the snow from my boots I entered a room. A gleam of moonlight followed me, and I saw I was in a big salon with a polished wood floor and dark lumps of furniture swathed in sheets. I clicked the bulb at my belt, and the little circle of light showed a place which had not been dwelt in for years. At the far end was another door, and as I tiptoed towards it, something caught my eye on the parquet. It was a piece of fresh snow, like that which clumps on the heel of a boot. I had not brought it there. Some other visitor had passed this way, and not long before me. Very gently I opened the door and slipped in. In front of me was a pile of furniture which made a kind of screen, and behind that I halted and listened. There was somebody in the room. I heard the sound of human breathing and soft movements. The man, whoever he was at the far end from me, and though there was a dim glow of moon through a broken shutter, I could see nothing of what he was after. I was beginning to enjoy myself now. I knew of his presence, and he did not know of mine, and that is the sport of stalking. An unwary movement of my hand caused the screen to creak. Instantly the movement ceased, and there was utter silence. I held my breath, and after a second or two the tiny sounds began again. I had a feeling, though my eyes could not assure me, that the man before me was at work and was using a very small shaded torch. There was just the faintest moving shimmer on the wall beyond, though that might come from the crack of moonlight. Apparently he was reassured, for his movements became more distinct. There was a jar, as if a table had been pushed back. Once more there was silence, and I heard only the intake of breath. I have very quick ears, and to me it sounded as if the man was rattled. The breathing was quick and anxious. Suddenly it changed and became the ghost of a whistle, the kind of sound one makes with the lips and teeth without ever letting the tune break out clear. We all do it when we are preoccupied with something, shaving or writing letters or reading the newspaper. But I did not think my man was preoccupied. He was whistling to quiet fluttering nerves. Then I caught the air. It was cherry ripe. In a moment, from being hugely at my ease, I became the nervous one. I had been playing peep-boo with the unseen, and the tables were turned. My heart beat against my ribs like a hammer. I shuffled my feet, and again there fell the tense silence. "Mary," I said, and the words seemed to explode like a bomb in the stillness. "Mary, it's me, Dick Hannay." There was no answer but a sob and the sound of a timid step. I took 4 paces into the darkness and caught in my arms a trembling girl. Often in the last months I had pictured the kind of scene which would be the culminating point of my life. When our work was over and the war had been forgotten, somewhere, perhaps in a green Cotswold meadow or in a room of an old manor, I would talk with Mary. By that time we should know each other well, and I should have lost my shyness. I would try to tell her that I loved her, but whenever I thought of what I should say, my heart sank, for I knew I would make a fool of myself. You can't live my kind of life for 40 years wholly among men and be of any use at pretty speeches to women. I knew I should stutter and blunder, and I used despairingly to invent impossible situations where I might make my love plain to her without words, by some piece of melodramatic sacrifice. But the kind fates had saved me the trouble. Without a syllable save Christian names stammered in that eerie darkness, we had come to complete understanding. The fairies had been at work unseen, and the thoughts of each of us had been moving towards the other, till love had germinated like a seed in the dark. As I held her in my arms, I stroked her hair, and murmured things which seemed to spring out of some ancestral memory. Certainly my tongue had never used them before, nor my mind imagined them. By and by she slipped her arms round my neck, and with half a sob strained towards me. She was still trembling. "Dick," she said, and to hear that name on her lips was the sweetest thing I had ever known. "Dick, is it really you? Tell me I'm not dreaming." "It's me, sure enough, Mary dear. And now I have found you I will never let you go again. But my precious child, how on earth did you get here?" She disengaged herself and let her little electric torch wander over my rough habiliments. "You look a tremendous warrior, Dick. I have never seen you like this before. I was in Doubting Castle and very much afraid of giant despair till you came." "I think I call it the Interpreter's House," I said. "It's the house of somebody we both know," she went on. "He calls himself Bommaerts here. That was one of the 2 names, you remember. I have seen him since in Paris. Oh, it is a long story, and you shall hear it all soon. I knew he came here sometimes, so I came here too. I have been nursing for the last fortnight at the Douvecourt Hospital, only 4 miles away." "But what brought you alone at night?" Madness, I think. Vanity, too. You see, I had found out a good deal, and I wanted to find out the one vital thing which had puzzled Mr. Blenkiron. I told myself it was foolish, but I couldn't keep away. And then my courage broke down, and before you came I would have screamed at the sound of a mouse. If I hadn't whistled, I would have cried." "But why alone and at this hour?" "I couldn't get off in the day, and it was safest to come alone. You see, he is in love with me, and when he heard I was coming to Douvecourt, forgot his caution and proposed to meet me here. He said he was going on a long journey and wanted to say good-bye. If he had found me alone, well, he would have said good-bye. If there had been anyone with me, he would have suspected, and he mustn't suspect me. Mr. Blenkiron says that would be fatal to his great plan. He believes I am like my aunts, and that I think him an apostle of peace, working by his own methods against the stupidity and wickedness of all the governments. He talks more bitterly about Germany than about England. He told me how he had to disguise himself and play many parts on his mission, and of course I have applauded him. Oh, I have had a difficult autumn." "Mary," I cried, "tell me you hate him." "No," she said quietly, "I do not hate him. I am keeping that for later. I fear him desperately. Some day, when we have broken him utterly, I will hate him, and drive all likeness of him out of my memory like an unclean thing. But till then I won't waste energy on hate. We want to hoard every atom of our strength for the work of beating him." She had won back her composure, and I turned on my light to look at her. She was in nurse's outdoor uniform, and I thought her eyes seemed tired. The priceless gift that had suddenly come to me had driven out all recollection of my own errand. I thought of Ivery only as a would-be lover of Mary, and forgot the manufacturer from Lille who had rented the house for the partridge shooting. "And you, Dick," she asked, "is it part of a general's duty to pay visits at night to empty houses?" "I came to look for traces of Monsieur Bommaerts. I, too, got on his track from another angle, but that story must wait." "You observe that he has been here to-day?" She pointed to some cigarette ash spilled on the table edge, and a space on its surface cleared from dust. "In a place like this the dust would settle again in a few hours, and that is quite clean. I should say he has been here just after luncheon." "Great Scott!" I cried. "What a close shave! I'm in the mood at this moment to shoot him at sight. You say you saw him in Paris and knew his lair. Surely you had a good enough case to have him collared." She shook her head. "Mr. Blenkiron, he's in Paris too. Wouldn't hear of it. He hasn't just figured the thing out yet, he says. We've identified one of your names, but we're still in doubt about Chelius." "Ah, Chelius, yes, I see. We must get the whole business complete before we strike. Has old Blenkiron had any luck?" "Your guess about the deep breathing advertisement was very clever, Dick. It was true, and it may give us Chelius. I must leave Mr. Blenkiron to tell you how. But the trouble is this. We know something of the doings of someone who may be Chelius, but we can't link them with Ivery. We know that Ivery is Bommaerts, and our hope is to link Bommaerts with Chelius. That's why I came here. I was trying to burgle this escritoire in an amateur way. It's a bad piece of fake empire and deserves smashing." I could see that Mary was eager to get my mind back to business, and with some difficulty I clambered down from the exultant heights. The intoxication of the thing was on me, the winter night, the circle of light in that dreary room, the sudden coming together of two souls from the ends of the earth, the realization of my wildest hopes, the gilding and glorifying of all the future. But she had always twice as much wisdom as me, and we were in the midst of a campaign which had no use for daydreaming. I turned my attention to the desk. It was a flat table with drawers, and at the back a half circle of more drawers with a central cupboard. I tilted it up, and most of the drawers slid out, empty of anything but dust. I forced two open with my knife, and they held empty cigar boxes. Only the cupboard remained, and that appeared to be locked. I wedged a key from my pocket into its keyhole, but the thing would not budge. "It's no good," I said. "He wouldn't leave anything he valued in a place like this. That sort of fellow doesn't take risks. If he wanted to hide something, there are 100 holes in this chateau which would puzzle the best detective." "Can't you open it?" she asked. "I've a fancy about that table. He was sitting here this afternoon, and he may be coming back." I solved the problem by turning up the escritoire and putting my knee through the cupboard door. Out of it tumbled a little dark green attaché case. "This is getting solemn," said Mary. "Is it locked?" It was, but I took my knife and cut the lock out and spilled the contents on the table. There were some papers, a newspaper or two, and a small bag tied with black cord. The last I opened while Mary looked over my shoulder. It contained a fine yellowish powder. "Stand back," I said harshly. "For God's sake, stand back and don't breathe." With trembling hands I tied the bag up again, rolled it in a newspaper and stuffed it into my pocket. For I remembered a day near Peronne when a Boche plane had come over in the night and had dropped little bags like this. Happily they were all collected, and the men who found them were wise and took them off to the nearest laboratory. They proved to be full of anthrax germs. I remembered how Eaucourt Sainte-Anne stood at the junction of a dozen roads where all day long troops passed to and from the lines. From such a vantage point an enemy could wreck the health of an army. I remembered the woman I had seen in the courtyard of this house in the foggy dusk, and I knew now why she had worn a gas mask. The discovery gave me a horrid shock. I was brought down with a crash from my high sentiment to something earthly and devilish. I was fairly well used to Boche filthiness, but this seemed too grim a piece of the utterly damnable. I wanted to have Ivory by the throat and force the stuff into his body and watch him decay slowly into the horror he had contrived for honest men. "Let's get out of this infernal place," I said. But Mary was not listening. She had picked up one of the newspapers and was gloating over it. I looked and saw that it was open at an advertisement of Weissmann's deep-breathing system. "Oh, look, Dick!" she cried breathlessly. The column of type had little dots made by a red pencil below certain words. "It's it," she whispered. "It's the cipher. I'm almost sure it's the cipher." "Well, he'd be likely to know it if anyone did." "But don't you see it's the cipher which Chelius uses, the man in Switzerland? Oh, I can't explain now, for it's very long, but I think I have found out what we have all been wanting. Chelius—" "Whoosht!" I said. "What's that?" There was a queer sound from the out of doors, as if a sudden wind had risen in the still night. "It's only a car on the main road," said Mary. "How did you get in?" I asked. "By the broken window in the next room. I cycled out here one morning, and I walked round the place and found the broken catch." "Perhaps it is left open on purpose. That may be the way Monsieur Bommaerts visits his country home. Let's get off, Mary, for this place has a curse on it. It deserves fire from heaven." I slipped the contents of the attaché case into my pockets. "I'm going to drive you back," I said. "I've got a car out there." "Then you must take my bicycle, and my servant too. He's an old friend of yours, one Andrew Amos." "Now how on earth did Andrew get over here?" "He's one of us," said Mary, laughing at my surprise. "A most useful member of our party, at present disguised as an infirmier in Lady Manorwater's hospital at Douvecourt. He is learning French and—" "Hush," I whispered. "There's someone in the next room." I swept her behind a stack of furniture, with my eyes glued on a crack of light below the door. The handle turned and the shadows raced before a big electric lamp of the kind they have in stables. I could not see the bearer, but I guessed it was the old woman. There was a man behind her. A brisk step sounded on the parquet, and a figure brushed past her. It wore the horizon blue of a French officer, very smart, with those French riding boots that showed the shape of the leg, and a handsome fur-lined pelisse. I would have called him a young man, not more than 35. The face was brown and clean-shaven, the eyes bright and masterful. Yet he did not deceive me. I had not boasted idly to Sir Walter when I said that there was one man alive who could never again be mistaken by me. I had my hand on my pistol as I motioned Mary farther back into the shadows. For a second I was about to shoot. I had a perfect mark, and could have put a bullet through his brain with utter certitude. I think if I had been alone I might have fired. Perhaps not. Anyhow, now I could not do it. It seemed like potting at a sitting rabbit. I was obliged, though he was my worst enemy, to give him a chance, while all the while my sober senses kept calling me a fool. I stepped into the light. "Hello, Mr. Ivery," I said. "This is an odd place to meet again." In his amazement he fell back a step, while his hungry eyes took in my face. There was no mistake about the recognition. I saw something I had seen once before in him, and that was fear. Out went the light, and he sprang for the door. I fired in the dark, but the shot must have been too high. In the same instant I heard him slip on the smooth parquet, and the tinkle of glass as the broken window swung open. Hastily I reflected that his car must be at the moat end of the terrace, and that therefore to reach it he must pass outside this very room. Seizing the damaged escritoire, I used it as a ram and charged the window nearest me. The panes and shutters went with a crash, for I had driven the thing out of its rotten frame. The next moment I was on the moonlit snow. I got a shot at him as he went over the terrace, and again I went wide. I have never been at my best with a pistol. Still, I reckoned I had got him, for the car which was waiting below must come back by the moat to reach the high road. But I had forgotten the great closed park gates. Somehow or other they must have been opened, for as soon as the car started it headed straight for the Grand Avenue. I tried a couple of long-range shots after it, and one must have damaged either Ivery or his chauffeur, for there came back a cry of pain. I turned in deep chagrin to find Mary beside me. She was bubbling with laughter. "Were you ever a cinema actor, Dick? The last 2 minutes have been a really high-class performance, featuring Mary Lamington. How does the jargon go?" "I could have got him when he first entered," I said ruefully. "I know," she said in a graver tone, "only, of course, you couldn't. Besides, Mr. Blenkiron doesn't want it, yet." She put her hand on my arm. "Don't worry about it. It wasn't written it should happen that way. It would have been too easy. We have a long road to travel yet before we clip the wings of the wild birds." "Look," I cried, "the fire from heaven!" Red tongues of flame were shooting up from the outbuildings at the farther end, the place where I had first seen the woman. Some agreed plan must have been acted on, and Ivery was destroying all traces of his infamous yellow powder. Even now the concierge with her odds and ends of belongings would be slipping out to some refuge in the village. In the still dry night the flames rose, for the place must have been made ready for a rapid burning. As I hurried Mary round the moat, I could see that part of the main building had caught fire. The hamlet was awakened, and before we reached the corner of the high road sleepy British soldiers were hurrying towards the scene, and the town major was mustering the fire brigade. I knew that Ivery had laid his plans well, and that they hadn't a chance, that long before dawn the chateau of Eaucourt-Sainte-Anne would be a heap of ashes, and that in a day or two the lawyers of the aged Marquise of Biarritz would be wrangling with the insurance company. At the corner stood Amos beside 2 bicycles, solid as a graven image. He recognized me with a gap-toothed grin. "It's a cold night, General, but the home fires keep burning. I haven't seen such a cheery low since Dixon's Mill at Gawley." We packed, bicycles and all, into my car, with Amos wedged in the narrow seat beside Hamilton. Recognizing a fellow countryman, he gave thanks for the lift in the broadest Doric. "For," said he, "I'm not what you would call a practised hand with a velocipede, and my feet are dinled with standing in the snaw." As for me, the miles to Douvecourt passed in a blissful moment of time. I wrapped Mary in a fur rug, and after that we did not speak a word. I had come suddenly into a great possession and was dazed with the joy of it. End of chapter 13.